which is why it's so clearly an ideological identity problem, not a policy problem. Why are people looking for these ideologies, for these identities? Is because they're not getting one. And it's because our society, in large part, has been so far removed from anything that's more tangible to a sense of identity. In a religious context, children being told, God is good. And they think, oh, okay, life is good. What I think is especially disappointing, especially harmful, is that in a secular context, who's there to tell a child life is good? When they see their parents, and their parents are anxious, their parents are depressed, their parents are addicted to social media, their parents seem to be acting as if life isn't good. Life is a burden. And I think that that's the real problem, is that we haven't replaced that sort of understanding that, hey, we're here for a reason. What is that reason? Let's engage with that reason. Let's say it's okay to not have a reason sometimes, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep searching. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep waking up every day thinking, how can I make the most of my life? How can I help the people around me? And I think that the real problem is we've stopped asking that in favor of other questions that seem more appealing, that don't have accountability, that don't have responsibility. We've seen what this leads to. And yes, as we've talked about in podcasts, it leads to anxiety, it leads to depression. But at the end of the day, it also leads to violence. I think we weren't really registering how there has been a trend in terms of a rise in violence. And that's something that, you know, we've talked about all these sorts of trends in rising depression, rising anxiety, rising rates of
reverse improvement.
Right, yeah, and all those sorts of things. Rising, oh no, everything's getting worse in so many ways. And it's like, then, but we weren't really addressing, like, there's been a rise in violence.
Actual violence.
Yeah, and it follows, right, from the fact that people are so anxious, people are struggling with mental health.
Yeah.
Right. But I think that I think that we really wanted to kind of connect what's been happening, especially with the Charlie Kirk assassination, and just with the fact that there is a rise in violence and that this isn't good. And what's even more disturbing is that some people aren't convinced that it isn't good. And I think that there's a real serious question as to what's going on, what is the underlying cause, and it's something that we've talked about a lot at a high level, but I think has really hit us in the past couple weeks, how much it is really manifesting in a tangible reality of very scary things going on.
Yeah.
And I think the last podcast that we put out, 2 podcasts ago, we were talking about the Meaningless Generation. And I think that this is really important in terms of understanding why somebody would think it's a good idea to take someone else's life. And ultimately, it makes sense that you would have to get to a point where you think that either life is meaningless or even more extreme, that life is bad, right? And I think that there's a lot that has to happen to get to that point. Because we were talking earlier, and I was saying, like, as humans, we inherently, our default is to believe that life is good, right? Because we are alive, right? So there's that, right? It's kind of a convenient thing. Oh, I am alive. So then, you know, we have...
Toddlers don't want to die.
Toddlers love life.
They love life. Maybe they'll get upset about things, but it's not directed at life.
Yeah.
It's about certain things. They just want the things they like about life to be all the time. So, you know, toddlers are very, they think their life is very meaningful.
And that's something that you can see a lot in the fact that it's basically universally accepted that, like, life has value, obviously. Right. And
I think that's the default.
Yeah. And there's so much that's just kind of like inherent in how we live, how we approach people, how we speak about things, that just has the assumption in it. Life is valuable, and also suffering is not good. Right. And a good life, like happy life, is valuable. In our podcast about the Meaningless Generation, we were talking about how much of our society is predicated on the assumption that we don't have to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? And how so much of the way that we especially approach children is you're going to school and there's no kind of fundamental answer to the question of why are you here, right? And there's no real conversation about that either. And something that we mentioned in our podcast about teenagers, we were saying that I said basically verbatim, like when it hits the mind of a child, what is the meaning of life? What am I doing here? And then the adults in their lives seem to be not interested in that question. When it is the most interesting and relevant question, that can then you just feel like lost, right? It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that there's a reason why the people who are, committing these horrendous acts of violence are often young people. And it's because I think a lot of teenagers, it's natural when you're a teenager to hit a point where you start asking those questions. And it seems like nobody around you has an answer.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's the real big problem is we don't have an answer because, one, we're not thinking about it, right? And we're not thinking about that question to even have the answer, to tell young people it's okay to have these questions. It's okay to not have an answer too, right? To not think, oh, because I don't immediately have an answer to what is the meaning of life, all of a sudden life is meaningless, right? That shouldn't be what we're jumping to, but it is what a lot of young people are jumping to because nobody's coming in with an answer to say it's okay to not have an answer, right?
Yeah, I think either they'll jump to that or, there are definitely people and solutions out there, subscribe to a religion or something like that. And then so I think you said there's also been a rise of people becoming, Christian and Catholics and people. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, there's been a decline in, there's been a rise in secularism, but then also recently you see rises in young people joining these. And it makes sense because, so it's kind of like, okay, as a teenager in today's world, you're faced with a question, what is the meaning of life? Oftentimes nobody's really talking about that, right? Especially in a secular context, right? And then you can be faced with, oh, hey, here's either religious institutions, they're talking about this, right? It's at least something like, they're talking about this, right? And I think a lot of young people are really starved for that, right? And then there's also the route of, actually trying to engage in that process. But the problem is engaging in that process is really scary, right? So then a lot of young people, I think, avoid that. And then there's either plunge myself into what I know. School, grades, right? Where do I get validation? Yeah. Where can I feel a sense of control and certainty, right? So then there's that a very obvious path, which is generally school. Yeah. And then there's also the path of, well, I don't have an answer. Maybe there is no answer. Maybe life is meaningless, right? And I think that basically, if you get in that state, that is a state where anything that kind of comes in front of you that you don't like, that might cause you a bit of resentment, that might cause you a bit of anger, that might think, oh, this is so unjust. All of a sudden, the answer of violence, the answer of taking someone's life is a viable answer, right? And I think that's the real problem. And I think that especially in our podcast about the Meaningless Generation, we were essentially saying, okay, what happened was basically everybody had homogenous views on the meaning of life because everybody had homogenous religious views. And then all of a sudden, with the Enlightenment period, you had a rise in secularism and people were questioning that. And this was kind of a collective existential crisis for the human race. And what we responded with was not a critical, constructive conversation as to how can we address this question. It was maybe we don't have to, right? And it seems like a lot of our society is predicated on we don't have to answer this question of what is the meaning of life. And I think that this is something where it's essentially setting up the fertile groundwork for young people to start falling into life is meaningless, right? Yeah. Because, people aren't talking about it. And so then you hit it, you think you're the only one who's asking it, you feel alone, you feel scared, right? And then Of course, right? And I think that because of that, then you have a lot of ideologies and those sorts of things that can be very capturing for people, right? Because they'll think, oh, maybe this is an answer. And I think because of that, politics has replaced religion in many different senses, because, people get so emotionally charged. And it'll become someone's identity. And I think that is something that is incredibly damaging because it's not allowing for the critical conversation of, politics. It's important to have conversations about policy, but that's not what really politics is anymore, right? And we're not talking about policy decisions anymore. It's just, it's an ideological stance, and people are talking as if talking about policy decisions is challenging each other's identity. And that's because that's how people feel. That's because they've made it their identity. But it's like, that's not what policy decisions should be. Policy decisions should be policy decisions. It should be,
now we're seeing like these talk shows and like, after we learned about the Charlie Kirk assassination, we were trying to see, okay, well, what are people saying about this?
Right.
And we wanted to like get it, get an idea of like, okay, people are agreed that this is bad, right? Like killing someone else is bad.
Yeah.
And then and before that, we also took a look at, I think one of them, anyway, we basically seeing like these talk shows and stuff, like so many are just so far removed from like policies. Like I have to remember that this is supposed to be about policies,
right?
Where now it just seems like throwing like insults at different politicians and getting so emotionally charged that we have gotten to this point where people literally think it's acceptable. Some people think it's acceptable to do this.
Yeah. Having a practical, constructive conversation about policy takes the emotionally visceral aspect out of it and would help people to be like, oh, hey, we're just talking about policies here. We're trying to do the same thing here, which is why that's not what you're seeing at all. Like our mom is an economist and she knows like, you have to run cost benefit analyses. And when it comes to like, both our parents, so work in the government and have experience with doing policy decisions, regulations, it's very complicated. It's very boring. It's very hard, right? These are not like emotionally charged like discussions, right? It's like hey, look at the data. We have some trends here. What's the cost benefit analysis? It's not which is why it's so clearly an ideological identity problem, not a policy problem.
Yeah.
And that what that's really pointing to is why are people looking for these ideologies, for these identities, is because they're not getting one. And it's because our society in large part has been so far removed from anything that's more tangible to a sense of identity, right? If you think about like we have these such, defined job roles of like, I'm an accountant. That's not an identity, right? That's a function in society, right? And so then you have to come up with some other sort of identity, right? And that's why then that's being coupled with politics, coupled with some kind of ideological stance, right? And I think that that's because we haven't learned how to integrate our lives. We haven't learned how to deal with these questions. And I think that part of it is like this is often correlated with a secular rise. And I think and that's something that we talked about in our religion podcast is that like supposedly as a secular person, you can still engage with these questions of meaning. You can still try to build an ethos. You can still agree that, hey, you should love your neighbor. You should, think about like what is good and engage with those questions. But often that's not what you're seeing, right? It's being replaced by these other things. And that's because those conversations are hard. And I think that what's especially disappointing is that in a religious context, then you have, children being told God is good, right? And they think, oh, okay, life is good, right? And what I think is especially disappointing, especially harmful, is that in a secular context, who's there to tell a child life is good? When they see their parents, and their parents are anxious, their parents are depressed, their parents are addicted to social media, their parents seem to be acting as if life isn't good. Life is a burden, right? And I think that that's the real problem. is that we haven't replaced that sort of understanding that, hey, we're here for a reason. What is that reason? Let's engage with that reason. Let's say it's okay to not have a reason sometimes, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep searching. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep waking up every day thinking, how can I make the most of my life? How can I help the people around me? And I think that the real problem is we've stopped asking that in favor of other questions that seem more appealing, that don't have accountability, that don't have responsibility, right? To talk about these big issues that you don't have influence over can replace those questions. But I think that we've seen what this leads to. And yes, as we've talked about in podcasts, it leads to anxiety, it leads to depression, it leads to all those things. But at the end of the day, it also leads to violence. And I think it really just comes down to, if you don't think that life has meaning, it's just about waiting for whatever comes in front of you to make you feel angry, to make you feel like, vengeful, to then just to then lead to these horrible outcomes. It makes sense. A lot of young people are going through this. This is why, you have especially young people struggling with these things. And it makes sense why a lot of this is manifesting in school shootings, because these kids who are struck with this problem, where are they going to every day, right? It's schools. And so that's where that's being channeled to. And then it makes sense why these famous figures are also being targeted, is because that's also what is in people's faces.
What they're seeing, yeah.
And so basically, I think what we've created is fertile ground for whatever somebody sees that challenges them, that makes them angry, to then result in these horrible events. And I think that we really need to start looking at the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is we need to start engaging with these questions again. And there's so much that we do that's so small, that seems so benign, that seems this couldn't possibly be harmful. But you ask a kid about their life, and they have this canned response of, oh, I'm taking these AP classes, oh, I'm going to apply to this college, I'm doing this extracurricular, I'm doing this or that. They're not engaging with the question of, what am I doing here? They're not engaging with the question of meaning. And the same thing when you ask parents about their kids, they say the same thing. It's like, I don't know anything about your child when you tell them about, their AP classes.
Extracurricular activities and stuff like that.
You're not talking about them as a human, because to be human is to be lost and confused when it comes to engaging with these big questions, right? And we never talk about ourselves that way, right? We never talk about our loved ones that way. And I think that then at the end of the day, if you have a society of that going on, we start to believe that we aren't that way. And then we forget that those questions exist, right? We forget that those questions are important. And I think that ultimately, the way that people can come together has to be, what is it that we all universally struggle with? And it is that question of, I wake up every morning and I have to figure out what to do, right? And we all have to deal with that, have to answer that. And unless we go down to deeper than the surface level disagreements or preferences that we have, unless we go down deeper to what is it that we have in common, we're always going to be divided.